Hi, I'm Victor. In this video, I'll introduce Flutter Web Element Embedding. This is a way for you to run your Flutter app inside of a web page. Now, this web page can be an HTML file or one generated by tools like React, Angular, or Vue. The host web page has control over the dimensions and position of the embedded app. You can embed multiple instances of a Flutter app in a web page, and this is known as multi-element embedding. But this video focuses on single element embedding, where you embed just a single instance of a Flutter app in the web page. I'll demonstrate this with a website that contains an embedded Flutter app. So this is a landing page for a random image generator app. So when you tap on generate random image on the Flutter app, the text on the website changes to 2 previews left. When you tap on generate random image again, you have 1 preview left. And when you tap the third time, you have 0 previews left. You have the reset counter button enabled, and the generate random image button is grayed out. So let's take a look at what happens when you build your Flutter app for the web. You do that using the Flutter build web command. When you run Flutter build web, you get some output files, but for this video, the relevant ones are the main.dart.js and the flutter.js files. The main.dart.js is your app's entry point, and this is the actual app that you wrote in Flutter converted to JavaScript, and this is what is going to be embedded on the web page. The flutter.js is the Flutter initialization script, and this is what gives you access to the Flutter object in your JavaScript. And this is the object that will be used to load the Flutter app or embed it in the web page. Now, let's take a look at the steps to embedding a Flutter app in a web page. So assume you have an HTML file that you want to embed a Flutter app in. The first step is to create the host element, and this is the element where the Flutter app will be embedded in. You give it an ID so you can easily query it in the JavaScript. And after that, you set the dimensions for the host element. Now, these are the dimensions that the Flutter app will be constrained to. The next step is to add the flutter.js script in between the head tags of the HTML file. Now, this script will provide the Flutter object which will be needed in the JavaScript. And then we'll add the script in the body of the web page. And in that script, we can add an onload function. And in the onload function, you get the host element using the ID. Next, you define the build configuration with the Flutter object that was provided by the flutter.js JavaScript file. And the main.dart.js path here is the path of the main.dart.js file. Next, you load your Flutter app using the flutter.loader.load method. Now, this takes over the entire web page because by default, when you don't pass the host element to the flutter.loader.load method, it targets the body element of the web page. Now, to fix this, we pass in the host element through the load configuration. Now, the load configuration also takes the asset base, and this is a path to your build/web folder. And this provides the fonts and icons that the Flutter app needs to display properly. Now that we've passed the host element, the Flutter app now runs only within the defined host element and adheres to the dimensions that we set on the host element. Now, let's take a look at how to make the embedded Flutter app and the host web page communicate with each other. This is done through the use of the JS interrupt package. This package gives the Flutter app access to objects and functions available on the JavaScript running on the web page, and it also allows the Flutter app expose objects and functions to the JavaScript. Now, let's take a look at calling a JavaScript function from the Flutter app. So the first thing you do is to add the function to the global scope. And then in the Flutter app, you use the global context object. Now, this global context is the equivalent of the global this or window object available on the web page. And then we use the call method function available from the JS interrupt on safe package. And this provides different extension methods to the objects available on the JS interrupt package. And to call the JavaScript function, we pass the function name to the call method and the argument. Now we call to JS on the function name and the argument to convert them from Dart objects to JavaScript objects. Next, we'll take a look at calling a function defined in the Flutter app from JavaScript. Now, the first thing to do is to define your function. And in the sample on the screen, the function is defined in a class. And the next step is to annotate the function with JS export. And JS export is an annotation provided by the JS interrupt package. And then somewhere in your code, it could be in the init state, you first export the class and you use the create.js interrupt wrapper function and you pass it the class instance using this. And this create.js interrupt wrapper function is available in the JS interrupt package. And then you set this exported version of the class to the global context and you use the set operators available in the JS interrupt on safe package. And then in the JavaScript, you call the function using the property set on the global object. Now, let's take a look at implementing the demo. The first step is to embed the Flutter app in the web page. Here is the code for the web page, and it's running on a Python server on the terminal. And here is the preview of the web page. And in the same folder holding the web page, we have the Flutter apps code. And the major logic and the UI is defined in this my home page state class. And this Flutter code is currently running on the terminal over here. And here is how it looks. So if you click on generate random image, it generates an image. And then you click again and again. And we can generate more than 3 images, which is different from what we saw earlier in the complete demo. Now, the first thing we need to do to embed this app is to build the Flutter app for web. So I'm going to close this running app here and run Flutter build web. Now that the build is done, we can head on to the HTML file. And the first step is to create the host element. So we'll create a div and give it an ID. We set the height and the width, and we can also give it a border radius and hide the overflow. So the next step is to add the flutter.js script in the document head. So let's check where the flutter.js file is. So it's in the build folder under the web folder, and it's here, flutter.js. So So the next step is to add a script to the body of the document. Here we can add the onload function, and we can get the host element using the ID. that we set in the HTML file. And after this, we can set the build configuration using the Flutter object available from the flutter.js script. So now we'll pass it the main.dart.js file. And now we'll check the location for the main.dart.js, and it's in the same build/web folder as the flutter.js. So we'll add that here. Okay, so the next step is to load the Flutter app using flutter.loader.load. So when we refresh this, you can see that the app has taken over the entire page. And this is because we've not passed it the host element defined here. So we'll do that right away. So we'll pass it an object that takes a config parameter, which is an object. And the first thing we pass it is the asset base. So the asset base is the base path for the assets, which is the web folder. So we'll have it as this Flutter app / build / web. And then we'll pass it the host element that we define up here. So now we can refresh this page and see it take only the specified dimension for the host element. Next, we'll implement the communication between the embedded Flutter app and the web page. So the first thing to do is to document the number of previews left on the web page when the generate random image button is pressed on the Flutter app. So we'll define a function on the JavaScript global object that can be called by the Flutter app. Global this.random image generated. And then the argument is number of previews used. So what we want to do next is to decrement the number of previews left when this function is called. So let's check the HTML element for the number of previews left. So this is the element and the ID is previews left number. So we can create an element for that. And then we create a variable to hold the maximum number of previews. Max previews. And now we can do this. Previews left equals max previews minus number of previews used. So this previews left will hold the current number of previews that are available for the user, and we can modify the previews left element. Now that the function has been defined on the JavaScript side, we can call the function from the Flutter app. So this is the function that generates the random image. It increments the generation count. So we want to pass the latest generation count to this random image generated function. So this would be global context, which comes from the JS interrupt package dot call method. The call method comes from the JS interrupt on safe package. So this, we copy the name of the function from the JavaScript to JS to convert it to a JS string, and we pass the generation count to JS to convert it to a JS number. So now we need to rebuild the Flutter app. Okay. Now that it's built, we can reload the web page. When you tap on generate random image, the number of previews has reduced to 2. Generate random image, 1 previews left. Generate random image, 0 previews left. So now we want to make sure this does not happen, -1 previews left. The first step is to prevent any further decrement when we've hit the limit. So we'll do that here. If the number of previews used is less than or equal to max previews, then we can run this. So go back and refresh. 2, 3. So now this has no more effect on this text. And the next thing to do is to enable the reset counter button on the web page. So first we need to get the element for the reset counter button. So this is it here, reset counter. So here, const reset counter button element. So after we've done the decrement, check if this number of previews used is equal to max previews. And if that's true, we remove the attribute disabled. And this is because we have the disabled attribute on the reset counter button. So we'll come over to the preview and refresh the page. Now I click 1, 2, 3. And on the third image generation, we see the reset counter button is now enabled. Now, the last thing to do is to have the web page modify the Flutter app by calling a function on the Flutter app to disable this generate random image button. So let's go back to the code. So the first thing we need to do is to define that function that will be called. So let's come here. Let's call it update button enabled state and pass it a variable is button enabled from JS. So this is to differentiate it from this is button enabled variable. So once this is called from JavaScript, we modify it. Is button enabled equals is button enabled from JS. Now this function will modify the button to no longer be enabled, because if is button enabled is true, we can call the function, and if it's not true, we just pass null in place of the function. The next thing we need to do is to annotate this function with JS export. So that means we can actually call this function from JavaScript But the final step is to export the class so that this function can be available on the JavaScript global scope. So final export, create JS wrapper this, and then we add it to the global context. So let's call this app state. Now the next thing to do is to call this function from JavaScript when the user has hit the limit. So here, and close this. So if the number of previews used is equal to max, we can call this function here. So global this dot app state and set it to false. The final thing we need to do for this step is to rebuild the Flutter app. Now we can refresh the web page and then tap generate random image number 1, number 2, number 3. Now the generate random image button is disabled. So the final step here is to add the functionality for this reset counter. Currently, the reset counter button does nothing. So we want the reset counter button to modify this text and reset it back to 3 and modify the text here to 0 and also enable this generate random image button. So the first thing we want to start with is to modify this text back to 3 once the reset counter is clicked. So we'll do that here. So we can add the click event listener to the reset counter button. So we can set the text content of the previous left element to the max previews. So we can refresh this. Step on it one time, second time, the third time, you have 0 previews left here. And when you tap on recent counter, you have 3 previews left. So the next thing we want to do is when you tap on reset counter, we want to disable the reset counter button. Reset counter button element dot set attribute disabled, disabled. So we refresh this. And now the button is disabled. Now we want to also enable this generate random image button when the reset counter is clicked. So this is what we'll do. Put this here. So we'll call the update button enable state and pass it true. Just like here, we called it and passed false. So we could just copy this and true. So now we can refresh this and you tap generate random image once, second time, third time. So when you tap on reset counter, this button gets enabled. And now the final step is to reset the actual number of generation counts on the Flutter app. So we're just going to do the exact same thing we did for update button enable state. We'll define a function. So we can call this reset counter. And we don't need to pass it any argument, since we can just set generation count to 0. And to make it available to be called from JavaScript, we annotate it with JS export. And this means we need to rebuild our Flutter app. And now we can go to the JavaScript and call this function dot app state dot reset counter. So now we can refresh the preview. We tap on the generate random image once, second time, and the third time. And then we come here to click on the reset counter button. You can see it's back to 0 and everything is reset to the original state. So this just demonstrated how to embed a Flutter app inside of a web page and set up the communication between them. So that concludes the video. Thank you.